On the 2nd of October 1992, a violent confrontation erupted within the walls of Sao Paulo's Carandiru Penitentiary. As tensions escalated between rival inmate factions, the situation spiraled out of control, prompting a heavily armed police force to storm the facility, culminating in one of the deadliest prison massacres in history. What happened inside Carandiru was a brutal and bloody crackdown that left 111 inmates dead and hundreds more injured. The floors of the prison were awash with blood, the air thick with the acrid smell of gunfire, and the cries of the wounded and dying echoing through the corridors. The Carandiru Massacre was a grim landmark in Brazilian history, highlighting the extreme conditions and systemic failures within the country's prison system. It exposed the harsh realities of overcrowding, violence, and human rights abuses that plagued Carandiru and other prisons across Brazil, but it was the response of the police that faced the sternest examination. Carandiru Penitentiary, officially known as the Sao Paulo House of Detention, was constructed in 1920 and became operational in 1956. Initially designed to house a maximum of 3,500 inmates, it was intended to be a model institution aimed at rehabilitating prisoners through work and education programs. However, over the decades, the facility became synonymous with overcrowding, violence, and deplorable living conditions. By the early 90s, Carandiru was severely overpopulated, with the inmate population swelling to over 8,000, more than double its intended capacity. This extreme overcrowding led to deteriorating living conditions, with prisoners crammed into tiny, unsanitary cells lacking adequate access to basic necessities such as clean water. The environment within the prison was one of constant tension and fear, as rival gangs vied for control over limited resources and territory. Violence was a daily occurrence within Carandiru. Inmates were frequently subjected to brutal treatment by both guards and fellow prisoners. The lack of effective oversight and rampant corruption among the prison staff only exacerbated the situation, allowing a culture of impunity to flourish. Previous incidents of unrest and riots were not uncommon, with numerous reports of clashes between inmates and violent crackdowns by the authorities. One notable incident occurred in 1989 when a major riot broke out, resulting in several deaths and numerous injuries. Despite these warning signs, little was done to address the underlying issues of overcrowding and violence. The conditions within Carandiru continued to deteriorate, setting the stage for the catastrophic events of the 2nd of October 1992. Carandiru Penitentiary was a powder keg of tension, violence, exacerbated by systemic neglect and abuse. The massacre that occurred was not an isolated incident, but rather the culmination of years of escalating problems within the Brazilian prison system. The 2nd of November 1992 began like any other day at Carandiru Penitentiary. However, tensions quickly escalated in the early afternoon. A confrontation between two groups soon degenerated into a full-blown riot as more inmates joined the fray. Prison guards attempted to intervene, but were quickly overwhelmed by the sheer number of rioting inmates. The guards retreated, locking the gates behind them to contain the unrest within the pavilion. Inmates, armed with makeshift weapons, took control of large sections of Pavilion 9. Fires were set, and the chaos spread rapidly. The prison's internal security measures were insufficient to manage such widespread violence, prompting the desperate call for external intervention. Given the scale of the riot and the immediate threat to lives, the authorities deemed it necessary to deploy a large, well-armed force. The military police, known for their aggressive tactics, were seen as the only option to restore order swiftly. Around 2 p.m., the prison administration, unable to contain the escalating violence, requested the intervention of the Sao Paulo military police. By 3 p.m., heavily armed police units, including elite shock troops, began to assemble outside the prison. At 4 p.m., after brief negotiations failed, the order was given to storm the facility. The police were instructed to regain control of the prison by any means necessary, leading to bloodshed and tragedy. Eyewitness accounts from inmates and police officers present a harrowing picture of the events that followed. Inmates recall the terror and confusion as the riot escalated, with many seeking refuge in their cells. Survivors described the arrival of the police as a moment of dread, knowing the reputation that the military police had for brutal tactics. Police officers recounted the challenges of navigating the narrow corridors filled with smoke and debris. Some officers later testified that they were under orders to use maximum force to quell the riot, while others expressed regret over the excessive violence that ensued. The police operation began with the storming of Pavilion 9. Armed with rifles, pistols, and shotguns, the police force entered the building in a tactical formation and quickly moved through the corridors, breaking doors down and subduing inmates. The initial entry was met with little organized resistance from the inmates, many of whom were unarmed or poorly armed compared to the police. The officers used tear gas and flashbangs to disorient the inmates, followed by a systematic sweep of each cell block. The strategy was to use overwhelming force to subdue any resistance swiftly. However, tactical errors compounded the chaos. The confined space of Pavilion 9 and the dense smoke from fires made communication and coordination difficult. The use of deadly force was widespread, with police firing indiscriminately into cells and common areas. Reports indicated that many inmates were shot at close range, often while attempting to surrender or hide. The lack of a clear chain of command and the intense pressure to regain control led to numerous instances of excessive force. Eyewitness accounts and subsequent investigations revealed numerous incidents of summary executions. Inmates who had surrendered or were found hiding were often shot on sight. Some were dragged from their cells and executed in the corridors. There were also reports of inmates being beaten to death with batons. One of the most disturbing aspects was the apparent lack of distinction between rioters and non-violent inmates. Many inmates, including those not involved in the riot, were subjected to the same brutal treatment. The excessive use of force by the police left a trail of blood and bodies throughout Pavilion 9. The official death toll of the Carandiru Massacre was 111 inmates, although some accounts suggest that the number could be higher. Hundreds more were injured, with many sustaining life-threatening wounds. The conditions for survivors were dire, with inadequate medical care provided in the immediate aftermath. Prison officials and government leaders faced intense scrutiny. The director of Carandiru Penitentiary, Dr. Jose Ismael Pedrosa, justified the actions of the military police by claiming that the intervention was necessary to prevent further chaos and protect lives. Sao Paulo's governor at the time, Luis Antonio Fleury Fijo, initially defended the police operation, emphasizing the threat posed by the rioting inmates and the need to restore order. However, as details of the brutality emerged, the official narrative faced growing skepticism and condemnation. The massacre sparked outrage among the families of the victims and the general public. Relatives of the deceased inmates demanded justice and accountability, staging protests outside the prison and government buildings. The societal reaction was one of shock and horror, as Brazilians grappled with the scale of the violence and the implications for human rights within the country's prison system. Public protests erupted in Sao Paulo and other major cities, with demonstrators calling for comprehensive prison reform and an end to police brutality. Media coverage of the Carandiru Massacre was extensive, with Brazilian and international outlets reporting on the incident. Newspapers and television networks provided graphic details and eyewitness accounts, contributing to a narrative of excessive force and human rights violations. The massacre quickly became a global story, drawing condemnation from media around the world and increasing pressure on the Brazilian government to respond. Human rights organizations were swift in their condemnation of the Carandiru Massacre. Groups such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch called for thorough investigations and accountability for those responsible. They highlighted the massacre as a severe violation of human rights and urged the Brazilian government to implement urgent reforms to prevent such atrocities in the future. The calls for justice from these organizations helped maintain international attention on the incident and underscored the need for systemic change within Brazil's prison system. The investigations into the Carandiru Massacre were fraught with challenges from the outset. Initial inquiries by the Sao Paulo state authorities were criticized for lacking thoroughness and transparency. Many accused the government of attempting to cover up the extent of the brutality and protect the police officers involved. The slow pace of the investigation and perceived reluctance to hold the perpetrators accountable fueled public anger and skepticism. The legal proceedings related to the massacre began years after the incident. In 2001, a formal indictment was issued against 120 military police officers involved in the operation. The trials were complex and protracted, with multiple legal battles over the admissibility of evidence and procedural issues. In 2013, a Sao Paulo court convicted 23 police officers of their roles in the massacre, sentencing them to lengthy prison terms. Subsequent trials in 2014 and 2016 resulted in additional convictions, with more officers receiving prison sentences. Judge Adilson Perez played a significant role in the trials related to the Carandiru Massacre. He presided over several key proceedings and thoroughly examined the cases. The judge faced considerable pressure and threats, but remained steadfast in his commitment to justice. His decisions were pivotal in holding the police officers accountable and underscored the judiciary's role in addressing human rights abuses. The legal responses to the Carandiru Massacre have sparked ongoing debates about justice and accountability. While the convictions of the police officers were seen as a positive step, many critics argue that the sentences were insufficient given the scale of the atrocity. There are also concerns about the broader systemic issues that allowed such violence to occur, including the conditions within Brazil's prison system and the culture of impunity surrounding police actions. These debates continue to shape discussions about prison reform, police accountability, and human rights in Brazil. Carandiru Penitentiary closed in 2002 and was demolished in the same year, with just one block remaining as a museum. The site has now been turned into a park where you can escape the chaos of the city. Carandiru and the immediate painful memories associated with it may have gone, but problems are still very much prevalent. As of 2024, Brazil's incarceration rate remains high, with prisons housing around 800,000 inmates in facilities designed to hold roughly half that number. The chronic overcrowding exacerbates issues of inadequate healthcare, poor sanitation, and limited access to legal representation, creating conditions that are inhumane and degrading. Violence within Brazilian prisons is still endemic. Gangs often control the internal workings of many facilities, leading to frequent riots and clashes that result in numerous deaths and injuries. The government's ability to maintain order and provide safety within these institutions is severely compromised. High-profile prison riots in recent years have highlighted the lack of effective control, with some facilities becoming war zones where the state's authority is virtually non-existent. Roughly 17,000 inmates have died in the Brazilian prison system in the last 10 years, but many of these deaths are directly linked to the authorities. Military police were implicated in the July 1997 killing of 8 prisoners, the December 1997 murders of 7 escaped prisoners, and the February 1998 killings of at least 6 escaped prisoners. The general apathy towards the abuse occurring within Brazilian prisons is deeply rooted in societal and political attitudes. There is a pervasive belief among segments of the population that prisoners, having broken the law, deserve harsh treatment. This punitive mindset is reflected in the policies and rhetoric of many politicians who often prioritize tough-on-crime approaches over meaningful prison reform. Media coverage tends to focus on sensational aspects of prison violence, further desensitizing the public to the everyday suffering endured by inmates. The Carandiru Massacre was a horror on an unimaginable scale, and while nothing even close to it has occurred in the 2 decades since, many, if not all, of the causes behind it are still very much in place. These institutions, horribly overcrowded and filled with thousands of prisoners with little hope, some of which are seriously violent criminals, are often ticking time bombs.